And I will say that if we don't learn to settle differences, really important political differences, through speech, which is an alternative to violence, then ultimately we will be staring into the abyss.
Arif Ahmed has been dubbed the Free Speech Tsar. His official job title is Director for Freedom of Speech and Academic Freedom at the Office for Students. Arif Ahmed, welcome to Political Thinking.
Good afternoon.
What's changed as a result of this new office, your new job, that new guidance? What would be different this academic year from the ones that have passed?
Well, thank you, Nick. I guess there are three things I'd point to. So the first thing is, as you said, there are now new duties on universities. They have to secure, or take steps to secure, freedom of speech for students and for academics and for visiting speakers. You can't stop people talking because you don't like what they say. Second thing is that they also have to take steps to promote freedom of speech. So they will have to think about ensuring that students have the right to talk about controversial topics and to engage them in a tolerant and thoughtful way, and indeed promoting discussion of difficult issues. And the third thing is that the body that I work for, the Office for Students, will have powers around enforcing some of these duties, and we have issued guidance to universities saying how we expect them to carry out those duties.
You put it in a more graphic way, a bit like that quote under the Orwell statue. You said, "You should expect to face views you might find shocking or offensive." Interesting choice of words. You should expect to find views. Why? Why should I expect to have that if I'm a student?
I think it's really important for university education. And in fact, if you go through your 3 years of university without being exposed to something that you don't find shocking, you don't find offensive, that's a serious missed opportunity, because that's how we learn, particularly in a world where there are all kinds of different views and very, very strongly held views about the most important topics in the world. If we think about international politics, if we think about morality and sexual morality, if we think about religion or race, deeply important issues in which there are so many divisions, people have to learn to talk about them rather than to settle their disputes in any other way.
But try explaining to someone for whom this isn't an important value, why does free speech matter?
I think the first thing I'd say is free speech really matters because free speech protects, most of all, those who have the least power. And that's what history teaches us, if it teaches us anything. If you think about minorities and the protection of minorities, perhaps the best example is the civil rights movement in the United States. Could not have existed without freedom of speech. More generally, I would say that freedom of speech means, what does it mean in this context? It means the student who feels unable to talk about problems with their accommodation because the university puts pressure on them not to write about it. It's the lecturer or the academic who's researching into human rights abuses in another country, who's pressured by the university not to do that, who has their funding pulled. It's students or academics, for instance, who go on protests and who are investigated even though their speeches and activity is lawful. All of that is freedom of speech, and it is, I think, something that all students will recognise.
The people who now are often accused of stopping free speech would argue they were trying to protect minorities. And an obvious one is trans men and women. And one of the key cases on universities was the case of Kathleen Stock. Now, I know there's a limit to what you can say because that's still working its way through the courts, isn't it? But she effectively argued that biological sex trumped gender identity. That's what she was arguing, and she was harassed for that. She eventually lost her job for that. Philosophically, what was happening on our campuses that meant that that sort of case could happen?
So just in terms of these issues, I think the first thing to emphasise is, of course, that freedom of speech is not the same thing as unlawful harassment, and freedom of speech doesn't protect people from harassing and abusing people where that's against the law. But it does protect people who want to express a very wide range of ideas, including ideas that many people find shocking or offensive. In this particular case, this particular type of case, I guess I'd say a couple of things. So the first thing is that this right goes both ways. So people absolutely do have the right to state the gender critical view on this debate. So to state the view, for instance, that trans women are not women, they do have that right. That's protected. They also have the right to say that that's wrong. And we will protect academics and students on both sides of that debate.
Do you look over the pond at what's been happening in the United States? Even the horror of Charlie Kirk being assassinated on a university campus because, as far as we can tell, someone didn't like what he thought and what he said. Get this wrong? Is that where we end up?
clearly what happened to Charlie Kirk was an appalling tragedy, and we haven't been immune from political violence in this country either, as you'll know if you think about the dreadful things that happened with Joe Cox, with David Amos, for instance. So of course, that's something that should worry all of us. And I will say that if we don't learn to settle differences, really important political differences, through speech, which is an alternative to violence, then ultimately we will be staring into the abyss. And democracy is not going to survive, and our society is not going to survive unless we can learn to resolve, or if not to resolve our differences through conversation, to continue the conversation and to learn to live with one another's differences in a tolerant way, even if you don't like them, because that's part of what a liberal modern society is. The alternative is either violence or censorship and suppression.
And how have you felt when you've seen people clearly moved by the death of someone they saw as a political ally, sometimes a friend, say, well, the answer to this is to deal with hate speech, because that's what led to his death. That's what we've been hearing from the president. We've heard from some of his closest advisors, his key policy advisor, Stephen Miller. Where does that lead us?
So I think ultimately that would be a mistake, because it goes back to the point about there are strong views on both sides of many issues, and people have to have the chance to express those views. There are, of course, laws against direct incitement to violence. There are laws in this country and laws in the United States as well, and those laws will deal with speech that actually directly incites violence. But you must allow people to express their views on really controversial topics, because there will be no alternative.
And there is another threat that you and your office have identified, which is a threat from what is grandly called in the jargon state actors, from outside states who want to control what is said about them by students, often coming from those countries. We're thinking of China in particular, for example. Is that something that your office wants to do something about?
Yes, we're deeply concerned about that. So we've seen evidence, and we have concerns that there's evidence, for instance, of English universities where students, for instance, who are dissidents, who have spoken out against governments of foreign countries, academics who maybe wanted to do research about the human rights records of foreign countries, we've seen concerns that they're being followed, they're being harassed. I've seen a report about an academic who is followed and harassed by a visiting scholar from another country who whispered in there, "We're following you, we're watching you," whilst that person was doing, research that could have been embarrassing for that country. When universities have arrangements with foreign countries, particularly obviously foreign autocracies, foreign dictatorships, that have the effect of suppressing speech in England by English students or by English academics, that's something that they would need to address. And if necessary, they will need to terminate those arrangements.
But ultimately, you can fine these institutions. You can take other action, can you, in order to ensure, to put it crudely, that the Chinese Communist Party can't, in return for an awful lot of money for students going to a particular institution or investment in a lab or a research institute, can't demand that certain things are and certain things are not said.
As the body that registers universities, we have powers, for instance, to require universities to do things. We can remove their titles to universities. We can fine them. We can ultimately cut off their access to public funding. So we do have powers, and we think it's really important that, as I said, academics and students who are talking about human rights abuses in foreign countries, expressing criticism of foreign governments, or indeed of domestic governments, any government, should absolutely have the freedom to do that. And universities are where that should happen.
Arif Ahmed, Free Speech Tsar from the Office for Students. Thank you for joining me on Political Thinking.
Thank you so much.